Ladies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Martin Kölling and I will be the moderator of today. And the topic is basically, the topic of our talk today is about the ongoing discussions in climate policy and the result and the consequences for Japan. And I might say that climate change is not a distant possibility anymore, but it is a reality. I can tell you that in my hometown, home country Germany, we suddenly experience things that in my youth we only knew from TV or textbooks, like tornadoes, unheard of. Temperatures over 40 degrees, unheard of in my youth. Also in Japan, things are changing rapidly. Ask the farmers in Saitama. They are not able, many of them have difficulties growing spinach in the summer season, as they used to do before, because the temperatures are too hot. Ask the rice farmers. The best rice growing areas are moving upwards, moving towards Hokkaido. So a lot of changes are going on, and we will be witnesses of even bigger changes that our current geoengineering experiment is going to produce. Luckily for us, we have a speaker with us who can explain to us what is happening now and how we can influence our ongoing experiment to change the climate of the world. I think you know him, that's why you are here. It's Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most acclaimed economists and leaders in sustainable development. He is director of the Earth Institute at the Columbia University, and in addition he serves as special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals. He is now 60 years of age, married with 3 children, and has no time for hobbies, he told me, because he is traveling around the world a lot. Okay, please give our guest a very warm welcome. And now I will hand you over.
Martin, thank you very much, and thank you for the chance to be with you. Let me speak just for a few minutes. I was told keep it to half an hour, but I thought half an hour is very long because I would actually rather make a few remarks and then open it up for discussion. I'm here in Japan this week for several conferences, including yesterday the launch of a new project called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN, for Japan. The SDSN is an initiative of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to help promote solutions for sustainable development. And in 2012, when this initiative was launched, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked me to direct a global effort to bring together universities, think tanks, major businesses, and governments around the world to work on practical solutions for challenges like climate change or environmental threats of other kinds, or the fight against extreme poverty, all of which are part of the Global Sustainable Development Challenge. And yesterday we launched the SDSN for Japan. It will be co-chaired by the UN University and IGES, which is, of course, one of Asia's leading think tanks on environmental challenges. And it will engage major universities and businesses around Japan. Why now, and why is this issue important? We're in a very key moment of global diplomacy. I hope it's a key moment. It remains to be proven, but these weeks are the weeks in which the global members of the United Nations have promised to adopt a new course for international cooperation to address the challenges of sustainable development. There was just a conference in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, 2 weeks ago called the Financing for Development Conference, which adopted a framework for using the global financial system, meaning global capital flows, development aid, and domestic taxation, to mobilize resources for sustainable development. In 2 months from now, even under 2 months from now, on September 25th, at the United Nations, the 193 governments of the UN will adopt Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These will be new international goals agreed by all countries to put the world on a more sustainable trajectory. And that will be on September 25th when those are adopted. Then just a few weeks after that, starting on November 30th in Paris, will be COP21, the Conference of the Parties, 21st session of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that will go from November 30th to the second week of December. And that is the attempt to adopt, finally, a workable global framework for heading off the worst of global warming. And we have been trying as a world community since 1992 to find a practical approach to global warming, but have failed so far. The first attempt was after the 1992 treaty was adopted, of course, in Kyoto with the Kyoto Protocol. And that was the big hope that the world's rich countries would take on the challenge of climate change and start to reorient their energy systems to prevent this dangerous tendency from occurring. As you know, the Kyoto Protocol did not succeed. It didn't succeed for two reasons. One, the United States didn't join. And second, the major emerging economies led by China were not party to it. And so instead of controlling the greenhouse gas emissions, they accelerated, in fact, after 1997. Then the world tried in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen to reach an agreement. There were very high hopes for that. That also failed because the US and China could not see eye to eye on mutual responsibility. And so after the failure of Copenhagen, there have been now 6 years of diplomacy to try to get an agreement this December. So this period from the Addis Ababa meeting, which was July 13 to 16, rather successfully completed, through the September special session of the UN, through COP21, are an attempt to reorient the world towards sustainable development. It's not easy, and you play an important role, I want to say, as journalists and correspondents who convey information to the public. This is not a simple topic to convey. Not only is it complicated, it's not a one-time event, it's not a dramatic moment, it's a slow-moving process which happens to be of huge significance for the world, but it changes so slowly that the politicians are not able to grapple with it, and the public feels that it's something that either happens or doesn't happen, but doesn't involve them very much. And so we have not been able really to find the global framework to change course. Let me spend just a couple of minutes to talk about what the goals are for the next few weeks and to measure why the stakes are so high. Sustainable development as a concept means that the world's governments are committing themselves to a more complex development process. Most of the global development process right now is oriented around economic growth. That's what's measured. That's what governments hold themselves accountable for. That's what we see in the headline scorecard every day. Did the growth beat expectations? Was it less than expectations? 2%. We thought it was going to be 2.2%, and so forth. And I would say most of our economic politics are around economic growth. The idea of sustainable development is that that is neither safe nor sufficient for the world. Economic growth as an objective is okay, but it's too limited. And it's too limited in two important ways. First, it's an average, and unless there is attention also to the income distribution, the average can go up, but with greater and greater inequality. And so a lot of people can be suffering even if the average of growth is okay. That's the US experience, for example. In the last 20 years, the US economy has grown well, but most of the gains have gone to the very top of the income distribution, whereas people from the middle on down are actually losing ground, not gaining ground. So the first point of sustainable development is to pay attention to the income distribution and to commit, which governments will do, to narrow economic inequalities between the rich and the poor. Whether they actually do that or not remains to be seen, but that's the first pillar that is going to be added in September. Social inclusion, it's called at the UN. And in these new goals, SDG Goal 10 says to narrow the inequalities within and among countries. So inequality becomes an added component of our objectives to reduce it. The second new part of sustainable development is that economic growth should be consistent with environmental sustainability. It most certainly is not right now. The world economy grows, but in a way that is increasingly dangerous environmentally. I don't think we have to look at the spinach growing farmers. We just have to walk outside today. There's a massive heat wave in Tokyo. And while that doesn't prove long-term change, I think it's most likely part of long-term change. This country is getting hotter, as is the whole world. 2015 will be the warmest year in the instrument record, going back to around 1880, and probably the warmest year for a lot longer than that. 2014 was the warmest year, but 2015 is going to be even warmer than 2014. And June was just declared to be the warmest month of June in the instrument record. The same was true of May, and the same was true of April. So 3 months in a row have set the highest record since around 1880. This is very threatening, and the trends are extremely dangerous. They're dangerous on many counts, but the dangers are already showing up in tremendous disruptions of the climate. Last week there was a meeting in the Vatican that Pope Francis called that brought together mayors and political leaders from around the world. Governor Jerry Brown of California was there, and he reported to his colleagues on the depth of the drought that has gripped California. And it's led to very, very serious problems, a very serious crisis, both urban and rural. But the mayor of in Rio his team was there. Brazil has a very serious drought as well. And other regions have very serious floods. Japan has had very serious floods in recent years that seem to be more extreme because of the ongoing climate change. And just to give you one more piece of recent information, my colleague, Professor James Hansen, who was the US government's chief climate scientist for 30 years until he retired last year from the US government, published this week a paper arguing of the very real possibility that the sea level will rise by several meters in the 21st century because of the global warming. This is much faster than is generally believed, and Professor Hansen argues that based on the geologic record of Earth, as well as recent observations of what's happening in West Antarctica, that the ice sheet in West Antarctica could quite possibly disintegrate much faster than has been believed, and that could lead to several meters increase of sea level. Yesterday, I showed a map showing how many regions of the world would be submerged if we had a 6-meter rise of sea level. Unfortunately, 80 or 100 million people in Bangladesh would find themselves living in an uninhabitable location. And I'm not too happy that my city, New York City, would become virtually uninhabitable as well, as would many other places on the planet. So we face risks that we don't have psychologically much of an awareness, or even scientifically too much of a predictability right now. And we have to change the direction, which is the purpose of this diplomacy right now. So the idea of these new sustainable development goals that will be adopted, that Prime Minister Abe, President Obama, and every other world leader will be adopting on September 25th, is to say that instead of one goal, economic growth, we have 3. The economic improvement, the social inclusion, and the environmental sustainability. What's interesting about these new goals, which will be called SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, is that they apply to every country in the world. And so the first thing to ask every government is, what are your plans to achieve sustainable development goals? In other words, this isn't just for poor countries. It's not only for development challenges, it's for every country, from the richest economies in the world to the poorest economies in the world. When it comes to achieving sustainable development, we're going to need new economic strategies and new technologies. And this, I think, is very relevant for Japan and its economic future. The challenging part is, of course, that the current ways of running the economy and the current technologies are no longer good enough because they are not environmentally sustainable. On the other hand, the challenge of coming up with the new technologies will be really the major economic strategy for high technology countries like Japan in the future. Yesterday, when we launched this solutions network, we heard from a senior official of Toyota. Of course, Toyota, everybody knows, is developing a new line of fuel cell vehicles, the first hydrogen vehicles being made commercially available. I believe this is a very, very significant event, because I do believe that in the 2030s, we will have to end our use and sale of new internal combustion engines, and by then have to go to zero carbon emission vehicles, whether electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen vehicles. and that countries that master that technology first are going to be the economic winners of the new sustainable development age. So I do think that the challenges that are going to be adopted in September and in December are also going to have a very big impact on the future competitiveness and job creation and prosperity of countries, and that those that focus on creating new technological approaches are going to be the ones that come out ahead. This brings us to questions like the future of Japan's energy system, because this is one of the biggest debates in this country right now after Fukushima. And I'll just say a brief word about this and then turn it over for discussion. The lesson of climate change is quite clear, and that is that we cannot continue worldwide with a fossil fuel-based world economy. And so whether it's coal, oil, or natural gas, all three of these energy sources produce too much carbon dioxide to be a major part of the long-term energy system if we are to stabilize the global climate. The specific agreement to be reached in Paris at the end of this year should honor a commitment that the governments have already made back in 2009, though they haven't said how they're going to honor it. They agreed that the extent of warming by human activity, especially by the emissions of carbon dioxide through fossil fuels, should be below 2 degrees Celsius, comparing the temperatures in the future with the temperatures at the start of the industrial age. That's what it means, 2 degrees Celsius, is compared to around 1800 temperature before industrialization began. We've already increased half of that. The temperature is almost 1 degree Celsius warmer today than it was at the start of industrialization, about 0.9 of 1 degree. We're on a trajectory of several degrees increase by the end of the century. And that's what my colleague, Professor Hansen, said would lead to several meters rise of sea level. So we have to limit the temperature to below 2 degrees. And according to Professor Hansen, well below 2 degrees. The only way to do that is to eliminate our dependency on coal, oil, and gas. This is not easy to do because the entire world economy developed on the basis of fossil fuels. Without coal, oil, and gas, there would be no modern economy. And all of our transport, certainly all of our automobiles, depend on petroleum. And our electricity generation depends on coal. And our industrial base depends on fossil fuels. So many people regard this as impossible to shift away from this. And the big energy companies resist this shift, of course, because they own the fossil fuel reserves. But the scientists are very clear that unless we eliminate the dependence on fossil fuels by around 2070, or what's called decarbonization, we will exceed the 2 degrees Celsius warming, and the consequences for the food supply, the sea level, extreme storms, heat waves, floods, droughts, and other calamities will be extremely severe. So that's what the agreement in December should be about, decarbonization. And it's interesting that at the German G7 that took place in June, the G7 countries, including Japan, of course, the United States, Canada, France, Italy, Britain and Germany, all agreed to decarbonize the energy system before the end of this century. And yet nobody has a plan actually to do it yet. So on paper, there is increasing awareness. In practice, it's still very, very difficult. Japan faces this challenge in a very poignant way because the debate about nuclear energy feeds into this, obviously. Nuclear power has been an important part of Japan's electricity generation. After Fukushima, there's strong public desire to end with nuclear energy. The government is saying, but we need that especially not only for power generation, but if we want low carbon power generation. And there is no plan right now that I believe exists clearly for showing what the alternatives are. My own view, we were discussing this beforehand, maybe a little bit different from our moderator, is that nuclear power is probably needed here and probably needed for the foreseeable decades, even though it's not popular, understandably, after Fukushima. And that if Japan were to not reopen the nuclear, it would end up with a lot more coal, oil, and gas in the end, and that this would be a very incompatible direction with the climate control. And I think Japan would actually suffer a lot internationally, maybe not immediately, but in 5 or 10 or 20 years if the economy were still based on the fossil fuels. Because I don't think that this is going to be tolerable for any major economy looking out 10 or 20 years as this crisis deepens. So my own view is Japan needs a strategy very clear for decarbonization. And yet there isn't really a long-term plan in place right now that's clear to the public and that's adopted by government, by the parliament, and accepted by the public. Japan's not alone in this. No country yet has an agreed strategy for decarbonization of the major economies. Not the United States, not Germany, although Germany has what's called the Energiewende, or the energy transition, which says that Germany is going to move to a renewable energy economy basically by the middle of the century, but it's proving hard for Germany to do. It's closing the nuclear plants, but it's using more coal in the short term, which is against the purpose of the Energiewende. So just to conclude with this case, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network that I introduced at the beginning has inaugurated a project called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, or DDPP. And it is a project of major energy experts around the world to try to show what are the choices that each country faces on how to decarbonize. If Japan chooses no nuclear, what are its alternative options? Not to go back to coal, oil, and gas, but to use other energy sources. How much would it cost? Could it be done? Is it technically feasible? What kind of engineering would be needed? If Japan chooses to continue with nuclear, what options would it face? How could it make the system more reliable, more acceptable? Are there new nuclear technologies? And some of them are in discussion, like integral fast reactors or alternatives that would be safer from the point of view of the nuclear power generation. So the idea of this network is to try to look at these issues in depth and then have the public debate them and present the alternatives. But I don't think that the fossil fuel alternative is really an alternative anymore, because we're already reaching the limits of what's tolerable, and the warming is dramatic and very dangerous. So all major economies are going to have to choose a decarbonization path, and they're going to have to choose a path that is publicly acceptable, technically feasible, and economically manageable. And for that, we're going to need a lot of analysis and expertise, which is the purpose of this network. Finally, let me say that for the COP21 negotiations, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project has been working with the French government to put forward an idea. The idea is that every government should submit to the world a plan for deep decarbonization. As you probably know, Japan has just submitted what's called its INDC, or the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution, up to the year 2030. But this is not a deep decarbonization plan. It's a very modest decarbonization plan. It doesn't change much in depth. So we are suggesting that in addition to the INDC, every government should also put on the table something much deeper, not for 2030, but for 2050, to say to the world, okay, we understand. Up to 2030, we can do this much, but afterwards, we can go much more deeply. Of course, we're not going to be legally bound by what we promised to 2050 because it's speculative. It depends on what technologies prove to be feasible. But we want to declare our intention to go much deeper and to show our public how we could actually decarbonize. So that's what we're working on. I want to encourage the government of Japan to adopt that concept of a deep decarbonization pathway, because I think that every major economy should say, okay, we're ready to do something even beyond our current imagination, because we understand that that's a global responsibility for the world. So I'll stop there. This is the framework of sustainable development. It's new. It's not part of our public discussion yet. It requires a different way of thinking about the economy, but I do believe that it is very important that we adopt this new framework. It's very important that young people understand it and embrace it, and that we look to the young generation to put it into practice, because the older generation, my generation, many of you, we have not left a safe world yet for young people. And we at least have to provide a good direction and then count on the next generation to provide a lot of the insight and energy and technology for success. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will open the floor to questions. Working media first. Yeah, Anthony. One question, please.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. Professor Sachs, your comments are quite alarming, obviously. Hottest May on record, June even hotter. I mean, this suggests that the climate change is proceeding at a galloping pace. Now, if that's the case, then presumably the world will be almost uninhabitable by within 10 years. If that's not the case, does that not suggest that some of these temperatures that we're seeing are aberrations? It's not proceeding from year to year or month to month like this. And same question. If indeed you're right and global warming is going to continue at an alarming pace, where is the crisis likely to be felt first? Will it be in temperatures that are simply too hot to live in? Will it be in rising sea levels? Will it be in damage to agriculture and so on?
Great. Thank you very much. We are right at the upper limit of the temperature that we've experienced in what's called the Holocene era. The Holocene is the name that the geologists give to the period since the end of the last ice age. So it's about 12,000 years. and it's the period of civilization. And that temperature has been quite stable, little bit of ups and downs on short-term or even century-long modest fluctuations. But because of the rise of the greenhouse gases, we're now at the upper end of the band of temperatures that humanity has experienced during the civilization period. Soon we will be outside of our experience in civilization because we'll be above 1 degree Celsius. And even on the changes that we've made so far, when they work themselves out, we will be at somewhere around 1.5 degrees Celsius warming based on the gases that we've already put into the atmosphere. Because what's happening is that the gases called the greenhouse gases, the carbon dioxide, the methane, and the nitrous oxide that we have put up during the industrial period hasn't yet warmed the Earth fully. It's not in balance yet because the oceans are still warming up. Like a big bathtub, they take a lot of time to catch up with the land warming. So we're already on a path of maybe 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're very close to not being able to stay below the 2 degree Celsius. The forecasts are that by the end of this century, on various projections of business as usual, we would be anywhere from 3 to 7 degrees Celsius warming. Of course, there's a huge uncertainty about the future of the world economy, the future of business as usual. But almost all scientists agree that if we were to be above 3 degrees Celsius, we would be in a kind of environment that our species has never experienced, because as a biological species, Homo sapiens have been a species for about 200,000 years, and the temperature has never been that warm during our whole life as a species. Indeed, we'd have to go back a very long time in Earth's history to have that kind of temperature rise. And what my colleague is saying, Professor Hansen, is that even at 2 degrees Celsius warming compared to pre-industry, the last time the Earth was that warm was the previous interglacial period, which was 130,000 years ago, a period called the Eemian, E-E-A-M-I-A-N. And when the Earth was in that state 130,000 years ago, the ocean levels were about 6 meters higher than today, which is not good for most of the world's major cities. So this is the kind of scale of challenge. This is perhaps on the scale of several decades. It's not year to year, but several decades. Now, there are still climate skeptics. They generally exist in places where Mr. Rupert Murdoch has newspapers, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Because Rupert Murdoch's media is a propounder of climate deniers, especially in the United States, Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. I don't know truly whether this is a game, a set of vested interests, or scientific illiteracy. But it's one of those. And it fits our politics because in the United States we have very powerful oil, gas, and coal industries. And that's true also in Australia. So whether this is vested interests of advertisers and colleagues, or whether it's simply the selection of this media owner of his editorial boards, I'm not sure. But there is this kind of climate skepticism. I would tell you, as director of a scientific institution, one of the world's leading centers of scientific knowledge of these issues, the Earth Institute, there is a consensus in the scientific community about the things I'm saying. Even though there is some uncertainty about timing and magnitude, the basic physics are accepted consensus science. I could explain why at length, but I won't go more into detail except to say that the science deniers are not speaking from the scientific community point of view. And I would add another point. These science deniers, climate deniers, said for many years that the warming had stopped, they claimed. This is evidently false. That's why last year was a new world record of temperature, and this year will be even warmer than last year. And so all recent analyses are saying there was no pause in the warming. The warming has continued just like the physical sciences have predicted. And there are many types of verification of this, including now very detailed measurements of the heat in the oceans, because the oceans absorb most of the heat that is coming through this imbalance. Where will this be felt? It's already being felt in the most marginal environments, especially the drylands of the world. Drylands are places that get little rainfall because of their fundamental climate characteristics. So they're the sub-deserts, like the Sahel of Africa, or the Horn of Africa, or the Middle East, where you get some rainfall. It's not desert, but you don't get very much rainfall. Maybe it's just enough, barely, to produce a crop of sorghum or millet in a normal year. And many of these places are now seeing a big decline of soil moisture because the moisture in the soil evaporates faster and because the precipitation is being reduced, which is what the physical predictions are. And one place like this is Syria. So Syria experienced 10 years of drought from the year 2000 to the year 2010. And from the year 2007 to 2010, Syria experienced one of the biggest droughts in its modern history. My colleagues and Dr. Shiv Someshwar, who's here with me, a colleague at the Earth Institute, we have colleagues who studied this drought as physical scientists. And they said this is unlike anything that Syria had experienced in its recent history. Now, we know what happened when this drought hit for 3 years. There was, and even for the decade, but it was a decade capped by a very intense drought. The crops failed. People left their rural households. They migrated to the cities. The food prices shot up. There were riots and unrest and protests against the government. And then the government clamped down because it's an authoritarian government. And then there was a beginning of an insurrection. And then violence exploded and arms poured into Syria. And it is right to say that while many things have contributed to the war in Syria, one of the things that contributed was the drought. And this is the kind of experience that we're seeing in many places in the world already, especially in the drylands, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel of Africa, and the Middle East. We're already seeing huge adverse human consequences. And I think that this is where we're likely to see the effects. In the Philippines, where we're launching the Sustainable Development Solutions Network next Monday, the Philippines has had a different kind of experience. If you look at a map of physical vulnerability, the Philippines has everything. It has earthquakes, volcanoes, typhoons, everything you can imagine. It's been hit by huge typhoons, some of the most powerful landfalling storms in recorded history. like Typhoon Haiyan. And the evidence is that these are becoming more intense as well. So I think we're already seeing in the very fragile regions of the world big effects, but these are now going to spread to more and more of the world over the coming decades. One of the points of the climate agreement is not only to stop the human-induced climate change, but to learn to live with it. Because some of it's going to happen even if we stopped everything immediately, which we're not able to do. And so adaptation goes alongside mitigation, is the formal terms. Adaptation means learning to live with the unavoidable climate change, and mitigation means trying to stop it. And of course, in the low-lying island economies, people are already leaving because some of the low-lying islands are already becoming uninhabitable in Kiribati and other places. So I think that we're in the midst of adverse change. There's no way just to live with it. No way that adaptation by itself could be enough, because the changes are going to affect hundreds of millions of people if we don't get this under control. But we're going to have to do both the mitigation and the adaptation. And finally, to answer your question specifically, right now it's food supply, it's heat waves, it's extreme storms. The sea level rise has been modest, let's say, but contributing to flooding in a lot of places. But it could become dramatic, because the basic lesson of the sea level rise question is that it will not happen by gradual melting of the ice sheets. It will happen by disintegration of the ice sheets, which could be far more rapid and dramatic than gradual melting. But the scientists do not have a time scale. They don't know whether this is decades or centuries, but they know that we're already on train for massive disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet in a way that will raise the sea level several meters.
Another question. Yeah, please, I open the floor.
Thank you very much, Sir. I'm very impressed by your all thoughts. And I'm Khalil Hassan. I'm Ambassador of Bahrain. Let's imagine we succeeded in decarbonization. Now, there are two questions. The first question, what we are going to do with all this carbon fuel in the world? And the second question, if we answer this question, can we have a better understanding with these very powerful oil companies and energy companies?
Good, thank you very much. The decarbonization path is approximately a 50-year process ahead, if we get this right. The way that the scientists measure this is to ask how much carbon dioxide can still be emitted from burning coal, oil, and gas and still stay below the 2 °C upper limit. And the answer is roughly 30 years at the current rate of using fossil fuels. But then we would run out of any safe space. And if we are on a declining path, we should probably aim by the year 2070 to have no more emissions of carbon dioxide. So the scientific answer is to phase out the fossil fuels between now and 2070. I should add one more technical detail. There is one technology that would allow us still to use the fossil fuels to some extent, and that's called carbon capture and sequestration. And the idea is you would burn, say, natural gas, CO2 would go into the atmosphere, but you would have a technology to draw the CO2 out of the air or out of the power plant and put it back underground. Instead of the natural gas being underground, you'd have the carbon dioxide put underground. This is a technologically feasible solution at some scale, but not enough for 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is what we're emitting right now. Some smaller portion of that. So the hard truth, and it's a very hard truth, is that we now know about the location, in other words, the proved reserves of more coal, oil, and gas than we could ever safely use. Some of what we have already discovered has to stay under the ground. But the oil industry doesn't feel that yet because it's still out exploring new projects. Even though there's already more than we could safely use. And it's exploring oil in places that are going to be more expensive than the current reserves. For instance, in the Arctic. We don't need Arctic oil and gas because we already have Middle East oil and gas that's lower cost. So why are we exploring in the Arctic? Well, it's because the oil companies don't want to respect the climate limit. They say, oh, we don't believe governments are going to enforce that. But thereby they're putting us at a lot of danger. So I'm saying to the oil industry executives that I deal with often, you have to respect the climate boundary and live within that. And that means don't explore in high-cost places like the Arctic or the ultra-deep sea or the heavy oil sands of Canada that are too expensive to compete with what we already know to be there. So this is a process that I believe we need to phase in decisively over 50 years. Of course, it raises a question for any oil country right now. What's the future? And for the Gulf countries, one thing is good news, which is that the solar energy available in the Gulf region is some of the finest solar energy in the whole world. And so the Gulf region could become a global exporter of energy from solar power. One of the very interesting things about solar energy, I should add, is that you can not only use it locally or export it on a grid, but new technologies allow you to convert the solar power into liquid fuels, synthetic liquid fuels, for example, that take the energy from the solar energy, the carbon dioxide from the air, and create new synthetic petroleum out of solar energy, which isn't environmentally dangerous because it's taking the CO2 out, and then when it's burned, it puts the CO2 back. It's a closed cycle. It's not taking the CO2 from under the ground and burning it and releasing new carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I would encourage the Gulf countries, which they're starting to do, to become major exporters of energy, of solar energy, both in grid and in liquid form or hydrogen that can be used for the fuel cell vehicles and so forth. We need to think about a new energy strategy, and each country needs to think about how it fits within that new energy strategy. Please.
What I meant, can you use the carbon?
Can you turn the microphone?
What I meant, can we develop a new technology where we can use this carbon fuel as raw material, then burning it?
Yes.
Is this?
So some of the carbon is used as fuel stocks, of course, for petrochemical industry, plastics, materials, and so on. there will always be a role for that. In fact, that's some of the high quality use. But there's more than almost surely can be used for those purposes. So some of this carbon has to be stranded, which just means left under the ground. And getting a good deal for that, I think, is important for your country and for Gulf countries. One of the things I've suggested to the Gulf countries is they should be advocating, don't drill in the Arctic. We already have our oil. But I mean, I think that's fair to say, by the way. I don't think that's a trick. I think that's a proper position, which is we have enough oil to provide the world with low-cost oil in this phasing out period. What are companies doing with new exploration? You'd find a lot of environmentalist allies in that approach. And I think it's important to have a good price for what remains, keep the price up, don't have it competing with Arctic exploration and so on, but have a path that is a realistic path over the future and invest very heavily, I think, in the solar energy, which is filled with in the region and is very low-cost energy. And with the technologies coming down, is going to be even lower and lower cost energy.
Do you have time for another question?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Our guest has time for another question. Any other questions also from other associate members?
Okay.
No? Oh, now hands are going up. So I will choose you.
Makoto Honjo, associate. You seem to advocate nuclear power for Japan, for the near term at least. But isn't that a rather short, sort of sighted alternative? Because you have to get rid of nuclear waste in a very earthquake-prone country like Japan, and stash it underground, and human civilization has not had a more than 10,000 years of written history, and I don't expect human civilization to be able to maintain nuclear control, in situ nuclear waste for another 20,000 years or so.
Great, thank you. I think the first thing that I strongly recommend for every government, and it's not easy to do, is to show a path of decarbonization. So it's not good enough for anybody, in my opinion, to say, we don't want this or we don't want this, without saying, here's our strategy. So I would say for Japan, show different scenarios. Here's the scenario of decarbonization with nuclear. Here's the scenario of decarbonization without nuclear. But what I wouldn't allow, in quotation marks, is a scenario based on LNG, coal, and so forth. So I think that it's possible to do this. We have done, for example, in our UN project, 3 scenarios for the United States of deep decarbonization. One of them does not have nuclear. One of them does not allow carbon capture and sequestration. And one of them includes both nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration. So the public can choose. But all of them are deep decarbonization pathways. And the ones without nuclear are more expensive because you're taking away one option off the table and you have to compensate it by doing something else. So my first statement would be every government should do responsibly different scenarios based on decarbonization. The second thing I would say about nuclear is that, like all of these other areas, we need to look to new technologies as well. And one of the ironies of the nuclear industry that we discussed in a workshop at Columbia University last April was that one of the most promising nuclear technologies, called integral fast reactors, which is a different fuel cycle from the current nuclear power plants, and is a fuel cycle that doesn't leave the nuclear waste, was actually in an advanced state of development until 1994, when it was abruptly canceled by the Clinton administration. And so Argonne National Laboratories was developing a very promising technology, which had two big advantages. One, it doesn't leave the nuclear wastes. And second, it has a passive safety system, so it operates at atmospheric pressure, not at high pressure like the standard light water reactors. And it was almost being brought to a scale demonstration project, and then it was abruptly canceled. And this technology is viewed very promisingly by many senior scientists, including my colleagues, and many industry leaders like General Electric and others. And yet it was stopped. And it was stopped in part because after we had 3 Mile Island in the United States, the US nuclear industry was paralyzed. Even though 3 Mile Island was a threatening accident, it was not a catastrophe in the end, but it paralyzed the public, and the public turned against the nuclear industry. And so we've not had the kind of technological advances that are needed. I think for a country like Japan that has modest renewable energy, but debated, because this is a matter of still needs much more analysis than I know to have been done. Nuclear, in my view, should not be taken off the table in some abrupt way and just ruled out. But it should be considered as one of the options going forward. And given the current reality, which is that there is a significant power base which the economy needs, it's a low carbon base, and over the coming decade or two, the alternative probably is, at least significantly, a lot of natural gas and even coal. I don't find that option a very good option either. So I haven't seen myself a credible option where the nuclear has just continued to be closed down. And that's why I say that while I am agnostic about the alternatives, I want to see Japan put on the table a real decarbonization strategy. And that has not happened yet. And my guess is that when it does happen, nuclear is likely to be part of that, at least for the foreseeable future. And with the technology emphasis, maybe even for the longer term future. And I do believe from everything I heard, which was, I'm not a nuclear energy expert, mind you, I think that's probably quite obvious. But from the experts that I did listen to, they believe that there is an option for safer, better fuel cycle technologies that have, for the wrong reasons, been stopped, and that should be started again and should be an active part of our exploration. And I can tell you, just conveying from people who know better than I, many of the scientists and engineers that are my colleagues believe this, and they believe that based on scenario analysis, that trying to reach deep decarbonization, eliminating the nuclear option, is making it very, very tough to do in a practical way. We're seeing with Germany also the same question, a little bit different, but Germany is phasing out nuclear. It's not doing what Japan did, where everything was shut down. But Germany's phasing it out and having a very hard time because it's using a lot more lignite, and it's importing a lot more coal from the United States, and it's saying, sorry, 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 you know, we're really serious, but it hasn't figured out how to actually keep its energy transition on track right now without resorting to more coal in the short term. And I would say to my environmental friends, because I'm definitely part of that community, most environmentalists are against some environmentalists are against every option. Some don't like solar because it takes a lot of land. Some don't like wind because it affects migratory birds, or it's noisy, or it's ugly. Some don't like nuclear because it seems to be dangerous. Some don't like hydropower because it floods places, or it creates reservoirs, or it requires long-distance transmission. Some don't like wind power. Some of the leading environmentalists in the United States said, we're all for wind, but just not near me. When it was near Nantucket Island, they said, that's ugly. We have our summer homes here. Don't do it here. And in Germany, there's no agreement yet how to bring the North Sea wind to Bavaria. This is a big part of the problem because you need long transmission lines, and the states, the Länder, are saying, no thank you, we don't want the transmission lines. So this is the problem, because then what happens is the status quo dominates, and the status quo is actually the dirtiest and most dangerous of all. And so governments need an affirmative solution. And if they don't want it this way, they need it another way. And I say that to the environmentalists also. You don't like this, you better show the alternative, and it has to be realistic, not just a dream world. And it has to be feasible technically, not just a guess. And I don't think we're at that standard yet in the analyses, even though we're with our backs against the wall.
Okay, we are 10 minutes over time already. Have you one last?
Maybe if it's short, and then, yeah.
Okay, very short question, Anthony, and then.
I am not a scientist, but I'm told by other people that some scientists say that this is partly related to sun activity, and that observing sun activity recently, they are predicting that we're about to enter a period of cooling, global cooling. What do you say to that?
Yeah. The solar activity can be directly and precisely measured, and it operates in a very, very small band compared to the changes we're observing. So this is one of the most tested, analyzed, published areas of climate science. And the physics are very well defined, the measurements are very systematic, and the climate scientists do not regard this as a major factor. The amplitudes of change are just very small compared to the changes that we're talking about.
Okay, and leaving on this optimistic note, I would like to give you a 1-year honorary membership.
All right.
So please come back. Next time you are in Tokyo, enjoy a glass of wine at the bar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.